Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. You know, we don't do a lot of whodunits here on Amazing Tales CT, but this one's kind of intriguing in a number of ways, and it's not just because of the twists and turns behind the shooting death of the first Selectman of Seymour 95 years ago, but also because of the cultural and social conditions surrounding that incident at the time, which was back in 1931. Frankly, tells us a lot about who we were. Well, here today to tell us his story with all of its surprising angles is a noted historian throughout the entire Naugatuck Valley, Rob Novak. Now, at the moment, Rob happens to be the town historian in Shelton. He's also served on the board of the Derby Historical Society, and he's just frankly extremely knowledgeable about the entire Naugatuck Valley region. Rob will be along in a moment to share this rather unsettling tale. This week's trivia question: how did written letters from loved ones, help World War II POWs escape prison camps? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. In today's episode, we're going to take a look back to a nearly 100-year-old case. It involves the shooting death of the then first selectman of the town of Seymour, Ray Gilliard. Now, I don't want to give anything away, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here up front. It's best if you learn about it the way many of us did, with the layers of the onion being peeled off one by one. Well, we're joined by a true expert on the history of the Naugatuck Valley, Rob Novak. Rob has studied the history of that region for years, and at the moment, he serves as the town historian for Shelton, but he's also been on the board of the Derby Historical Society, and at one time, he used to go back through past editions of local newspapers from more than 100 years ago, finding many incredible stories and sharing them with others to bring them back to life. Well, today's story is one of those stories. Rob, I think in order to put this in the proper perspective, we have to put people's minds in the time frame, right? So it's 1930, darn near a century ago, about 100 years ago. And, you know, this was a different world in many ways, technologically, you know, cell phones and that sort of thing, but also socially. And we'll get into that. I don't want to give it away too early, so we'll come back to that later. But at this point in late 1930, winter of 1930, a guy named Charles Buckingham is coming home from a veterans fireman social, and he gets robbed. And would you pick up the story? What happens there, and how does Ray Gilliard, the first selectman of Seymour, get involved with this?
Well, apparently Charles Buckingham was held up in front of his home when returning from the charity event you just mentioned. Some money was stolen. He described his assailants as a gang of 6 African American individuals. That wasn't the term they used back then, but that's what we'll go with. The Seymour police investigated. First Selectman Raymond Gilliard was a friend of law enforcement, was very popular, basically gave the police all the resources they needed. Ultimately, 6 individuals were arrested. Now, of those 6 individuals, they went to trial, I believe, in March. 1 turned on the other 5 for state evidence. 2 were sent to jail for relatively short prison terms. When I say short, I mean about a year, which by the standards of those days was short. And the other 3 remaining, well, 4 really, were let go. There was some apparent confusion and consternation in Seymour as to why they received light jail sentences and why 4 were let go. But that seemed to be the end of the story, but it really wasn't.
Right. Now we get into spring of 1931. Mr. Gilliard goes to his postal box and gets a letter, and I even hate to read this, but this was the terminology that was in the letter, and this was quoted. We understand that you have been sending some colored boys up, are out to get you, get ready, postmarked from Seymour. And what kind of effect did that have on Ray?
Well, according to the information I read, it wasn't that much. He did show it to a few people, but apparently he wasn't overly concerned about it.
So now we're still in spring, coming very close to the beginning of summer. It's early May. And he's a member of the Elks Club. And so he's going to go to his weekly Elks Club meeting in neighboring Ansonia, where he used to be one of the leaders of that group. And what happened to him on the way home from that Tuesday evening meeting?
He claimed that he was shot at. There was a bullet hole in the door, the driver's side door of his automobile. He was shot at along what was called the Old Ansonia Road, which ran along the east side of the Naugatuck River, a little bit up the riverbank. There were no witnesses. He later received a second letter, postmarked from Derby, saying, "We didn't get you on and this is on a Thursday. We didn't get you Tuesday, but we'll get you next time." So at this point, he's getting a little more concerned, allegedly. He showed it to the Seymour Police Department, which back then, Seymour really had more of a constabulary. It wasn't much of a police department. The closest major police department was the Ansonia Police Department. Of course, he was returning from Ansonia. So he showed it to the Ansonia Police Chief.
Now, as I heard this story, they came up with this scheme for the next weekly meeting, which would have been another Tuesday night, May 12th. And what they were going to do was follow him in an unmarked car and see if they could, identify anybody who might cause him trouble, or see if, somebody was to shoot at him again. And that plan was sort of hatched. And then that morning, this is when the floodgates broke open, and he goes to work instead in his usual routine, dispatches the crews. And what happens after that?
The problem here is that the story kind of changed, okay? Apparently, he arrived at work at about 6 a.m. At 6:05, he talks to the town foreman, basically in charge of the work crews, across the street from the town hall, which was on 2nd Street and Raymond Street. And if that doesn't sound familiar, that entire area was basically annihilated by the 1955 flood. I don't believe either one of those streets even exist anymore. They talk a little bit. He goes into his office, the first selectman's office in Seymour Town Hall, which was a converted farmhouse. He basically had an entire wing of the building. And at 6:30 in the morning, he makes a phone call to the SNET operator, which changed things significantly.
Again, to put people's mindset properly, there's no 911. If you had an emergency back then, you picked up the phone. And in this case, Edith Noyak, who was the operator on duty at the Southern New England Telephone Company central office on Main Street, picked up the phone. And what did she say that Ray Gilliard said to her?
Well, you're right. There was no direct dialing. You pick up the receiver and the operator would be waiting on the other side. She claimed that at 6:30, he claimed that he had been shot, and to call the police and to call the town doctor. The line then went dead.
And didn't he say that he was shot by 3 black men?
He did say that, yes. Edith actually called him back. The phone was off the hook. There was nothing, just silence. So Edith, at this point, hoping there was somebody at the other end, was basically saying, hang on, help is coming, hang on.
Police and the doctor get there. What do they find?
What the coroner reported was a little bit different from what was initially reported. They did find First Selectman Gilliard dead in his office. He was leaning against the leg of a desk. He appeared to have died instantly from a very close range 45 caliber bullet to the heart.
And that 45 caliber pistol was found on the floor near him, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was about 2 feet away from one of his legs, yeah.
And that was a gun that they later determined he owned, correct?
This guy usually kept a 22 and a 45 on him. The 45 was usually kept in a side desk, one of those roll-up desks. He had a 22, which was found in his car. Another 22 was found sitting on a desk in the middle of the room along with his hat. They later determined that there were 3 bullet holes about the office that were fired from with the .22 that didn't hit anything or anyone. They just, hit like windowsills and stuff like that.
We'll come back to where the bullets were in just a second. You said something very important early on, which was that he was a friend of the police. And so when the police got there, the initial reports were that he had been murdered. And in fact, I think the Evening Sentinel or the local newspaper, I'm not exactly sure which one it was, blared across the headline that he had been murdered by 3 Negroes that day.
Yes. Now, do the math. Of the 6 men that were arrested, 1 turned state evidence, 2 went to jail. Who's left? 3. That's basically what the people on scene immediately concluded, based upon the notes, that this was a revenge murder for putting the other 2 away. I don't think the person who actually turned against the other 2 was actually implicated, but 3 were. There was also a report of 3 African-American men seen speeding away from town towards Ansonia in an older model car. So when the state police, who their barracks was located in Beacon Falls, arrived on scene along with the Ansonia police and later the New Haven Detective Bureau, City of New Haven Detective Bureau, since it's New Haven County, they immediately started a be on the lookout for 3 African-American men in a older model car. Needless to say, it was not a good day in Connecticut to be an African-American man riding with 2 friends in a car that day. People from as far away as New London were pulled over and detained.
I understand that at one point they had 5 men and 3 women under arrest until this was sorted out.
Yes, if there's any hero at all in this story, it's the New Haven County coroner, James Corrigan. It was actually on his orders that the 5 men and 3 women were detained. Now, they were called what African-American people were called at that time and place, but when you listen to their description, one was described as a Portuguese Negro. Well, okay, that's Brazilian. Another one was described as Caribbean. Another one was described as Spanish. Well, okay, that's Hispanic. It sounds like what the common thread was, they were outsiders. There were well-known African-American families, many of whom were there longer than most of the Caucasian families in the valley. None of them appeared to be involved at all. And yes, the coroner asked for the 5 men to be detained. They were held in Ansonia, and 3 women who were accomplices, they were held in Derby. I should note that I believe it was early 1880s, the Ansonia police chief was actually killed by a local African-American, Chip Smith. In fact, legal scholars may have heard of the Chip Smith defense. It's still used today. From what I hear, they were ready to dispense frontier justice on Chip Smith before the police arrived. That was not the case here. But it does make me wonder if, mindful of this, the coroner might have wanted them held both because they were flight risks and for their own protection.
This starts to unravel really the day of the funeral, and Cunningham, the coroner, has not come out with his official report yet, but I think it was the New Haven Register newspaper had either spoken to him or somehow gotten some word on what was in there, and maybe had even spoken to the gentleman who did the autopsy. But as the funeral is being held, there are newspaper reports coming out using the word suicide, and a radio report is received saying that the fingerprints on the gun were Ray Gilliard's fingerprints. And so now there's this little whisper campaign, but the town wasn't buying it, was it?
The reason why I brought up what happened in Ansonia in the previous century was the mood in the town was described as gloomy and depressed. Apparently, Gilliard was a friend of everyone, but it wasn't like it was, in the last century, where we're going to get the perpetrators and, they better hope that the police get them before we do. None of that was going on. Like I said, it was more a general gloom. Apparently, even by the following morning, rumors were starting to circulate that he may have committed suicide. Ironically, that radio report you mentioned was actually proven false by the county coroner afterwards. Members of the New Haven Police Department and the state police, who were a little more experienced at this, were concluding on their own it was a suicide, and that was starting to leak out There was also leaks apparently coming from the county coroner's office. I know his death certificate, when it was issued the day of the funeral, was said to have been shot by an assailant, town of Seymour. That was by the New Haven County Medical Examiner. It was mentioned that by the time of the coroner's report being issued on, I believe it was June 6th, that it was generally being more and more accepted that he had committed suicide. But it's interesting to note that even the Evening Sentinel, the local newspaper, took a few days before they came around to that. They quoted the Associated Press and others as saying it might be a suicide, but not only did they not believe it, but they even published this editorial, making Gilliard out to be some white knight fighting the forces of evil, sleep well, good soldier, we'll take the fight from here, that type of stuff.
And the unraveling, if you want to call it that, of the story that had been out in the public really started to come with old-fashioned police work where they, going back now to that .22 caliber gun that they found on the desk and lining up where the shots were fired from, because originally they had said that they thought and they speculated that Gilliard had been in a side room, had come out, confronted these three black men, and that, he was shot at with these various pistols, and that one of them during a fight grabbed his .45 and shot him in the chest. Well, when they started to line up where those bullet holes went that you referenced earlier from the .22, that just fell apart. Didn't make any sense, did it?
Well, on June 6th, the coroner did issue his formal report. It was a 2,300-word ruling. I actually have kind of bullet points on all of the holes in this theory. I should also mention that a major sign that this was falling apart was on May 14th, the county coroner ordered the release in the Derby and Ansonia lockups, saying, I have no evidence that these individuals were responsible. So they were let go. And that was all the way back on the 14th.
And so now it's a month later when the coroner's report is actually released.
Yeah, among the things he cited, the telephone was found neatly on the desk. There was no blood between the telephone and the desk. There was no blood below his belt if he was standing up. Don't you think some of it would have dripped below that? His .22 was sitting in the middle of a desk that supposedly 3 shots were fired. If you're there to shoot somebody, are you really going to put the .22 neatly on the desk? The area where the car was supposedly attacked was at night. There's no lights. The road was only 18 feet wide, and there were thick bushes from the road to the river, which is where the bullet supposedly was fired from. It's not likely that car or any other car would have been recognized with that low light condition. There were powder burns on the body and clothing, indicating the gun was held to the chest when fired. There were no other tears in the clothing. It was freshly laundered and in good order. Wasn't he supposedly fighting off his attackers? No furniture in the room was disheveled, despite the claims of a struggle. Raymond Gilliard was a whopping 220 pounds and muscular. It is not likely that 3 assailants would have gotten a gun against his chest, especially if they had just got done firing a .22 at them, and now he's fighting back. And there would have been bloodstains in more places of his body. There was no contusions from apparently falling. The fatal bullet was found under the body, which is kind of indicating he was ordinary reclining position. The wound was serious enough that he shouldn't have been able to speak on the phone. The handwriting was inconclusive. Immaculate script, punctuation, and spelling. Remember how I said that the people that he was accusing of doing this were from South America or the Caribbean? Perfect English? Possibly, but the testimony he supposedly gave against these individuals, it was considered relatively unimportant. This is the big part of the bombshell. Apparently, he had been living beyond his means for a number of years, had a large amount of indebtedness, which was growing, and he had no way out, which that was not unheard of in 1931. The house was mortgaged. His wife had considerable wealth from 3 estates, but it was spent. The only asset he really had was his $2,500 a year salary. He had a meat bill that had been accumulating for 3 years to $1,259.18. That is almost half of his annual salary. He had made several promises since January to pay it, but never did. Apparently, there was a meeting on it with his creditors on May 11th, the evening before the suicide. He did not have the money, but promised to bring it at 6 a.m. on May 12th. What time was he seen entering town hall? 6:05 a.m. on May 12th. And he called the operator at 6:30 that morning. The coroner said, and I'm quoting him, "I am of the opinion that the deceased financial outlook was very dark. He saw himself sinking deeper and deeper into debt, and rather than face the future and the prospect of losing his home, drastically reducing his standard of living, and unable to provide his children with higher education, he took his own life, firing a shot into the side of his own car, the 322 caliber shots in the office, writing himself the threatening letters, and reporting the assassination upon the telephone in order to disguise his suicide as murder. I find that Raymond E. Gilliard died of his own hand, and therefore no other person or persons is criminally responsible for his death."
That's just stunning. And I think the other part that's kind of interesting, maybe to use that word, is that very few people know this story unless they're, such as yourself, have really studied the history of the area.
You know, it's funny. I had heard of the shooting of the Ansonia police chief in the early 1880s. I never heard of the Gilliard murder until afterwards. And I think it was just something that people just wanted to forget. I mean, on one level, in 1931, a lot of this was going on. I mean, it kind of was the end of the world as they knew it. You know, Calvin Coolidge was still president. It was before the New Deal. Seymour was hit very hard. There were bread lines. This guy appears to have been a people pleaser, was living beyond his means, and probably couldn't handle the idea that he was going to basically be humbled and lose his home. But my sympathy ends for him in that it wasn't enough that he took his own life. He wanted to send 3 innocent people to jail. Not only 3 innocent people, but people who the Seymour police tried and failed to convict earlier that year. To me, that's kind of unforgivable. You know, I have a hard time with that.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Well, there were a lot of difficult topics in this week's episode, and sometimes learning about our history means we have to come face to face with some rather unpleasant topics. It brings back to mind the old saying that if you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it. I want to thank our guest for today's program, noted Naugatuck Valley historian Rob Novak. He's currently the town historian in Shelton. The answer to this week's trivia question, well, the question was, how did written letters from loved ones help World War II POWs escape prison camps? Well, the answer is that those letters were written in secret code and they had important messages embedded in them. Well, next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to speak with the descendant of one of the military soldiers who worked in a top secret facility outside Washington, D.C., creating James Bond-like tactics and devices to help captured American soldiers escape. You won't want to miss it. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.